If you'd like to support the show and listen ad-free on any podcast player, you can follow the link in our episode descriptions to become an Acast Plus member for as little as $1 per month. It'd be hugely appreciated.
Choosing what career to do and what work to pursue is one of the biggest personal questions people face in their day-to-day lives. But Ant, what's the problem we're going to address when we talk about that this episode?
Well, I think the problem that we're addressing this episode is really along a capitalism kind of analysis bend that we've been doing for the last few, because we've done a lot about taxes and
properties.
The one about properties and stuff. This one is kind of coming back to like the Facebook question we asked a long time ago, one of our most popular episodes, are you a bad person if you work at Facebook? And it's coming to the morality or the ethics around your career choices, right? And really, I mean, to summarize it, we were saying, what's a good way of putting it? It's should you be optimizing for work where pay is good or where you do good? And really, like, should there be a distinction between the two? You would think that it would be the most valuable, societally valuable work that does good, but that doesn't actually seem to be what happens.
It doesn't correlate always with what pays well, does it? So.
Exactly. We're keeping this episode relatively quick succession, 2 ones. It's actually based on an essay that I will be publishing soon, so we're kind of taking that essay and turned it into a script, and I will link that from either my Medium or I don't know, wherever else I choose to publish that in the show notes. So Jake, we're going to take a little bit of format where there's some questions and answers using the essay. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, we'll get right into that. But first, welcome to the show. Guys, thanks for tuning in. I'm Jake, obviously. This is Ant.
The recurring guest, as we described last time. I can't remember which episode. Oh, I was listening back to one and it's like, I'm also a co-host, by the way. In case that isn't obvious from context. You may know me from a quiz show that I may be appearing on at some point. Oh my God, spoiler there, but it'll be a long time.
That'll be exciting. Just a tiny bit of housekeeping. You'll have heard the Acast Plus membership quest at the beginning. If you're keen, sign up for that. Any way of supporting us is fantastic. The other biggest way you can support us is hitting follow on Spotify or whichever other platform you listen to us on.
Or sending gifts directly to our office, whatever.
Yeah, we like that too. You could be the first. And yeah, thank you for leaving your reviews, guys. We also really appreciate those and it helps other people find the show.
Yes. Okay, Jake, so straight into the episode.
As always, it's good to kick off with definitions. Since we still need to perfectly refine the title, you'll know what the title is when you're listening to it.
Yes. It'll be something along the lines of how do you find meaningful work, or how do I choose an ethical career?
Yeah, right. Work, money or meaning?
Money, yeah, actually I think that's a good one. Work, money or meaning.
Leah will be dead chuffed with that because that
was that hers? Oh God, no, we can't use that one then. That was the one I liked a lot. I wanted money or meaning. We'll go with that. Go on.
But yeah, first thing to define then is, what is work?
Okay, interesting. Well, work is obviously the way that you will productively fill your life, right? It is the stuff that you are doing. I was not expecting that question. Where was? Oh, it is there.
It's the first question. I can provide a sort of answer to that. Like you said, I think work is essentially the time allocated to contributing to society. It's normally...
Is that necessarily true? Contributing to society? I think it's the thing.
Not necessarily. It's something it's the way you sell your time.
Yeah, it's value productive activity that you do definitely to support yourself, and we would hope that it's structured such that the ways that you are supporting yourself are useful in general, right?
But that, I guess, is kind of driving at the problem we're going to discuss. I remember actually back at uni, we did this for one of the more like fluffy management modules, and there was a whole piece that one of the modules in the week was why do we work? What is work? There were loads of theories. The more banal being like, banal.
Banal,
yeah. The more
I thought you were talking about Bain, the consulting company.
The more banal being like, work is something that structures your day, all the way through to like, work is how we find meaning, work is how we give back to others, work is literally how we earn a living. Lots of things going on there. But yeah, essentially we're going to be talking about work in the way that you most colloquially understand it, as this is the part of my time that I sell and make a career around. I guess a career is slightly different from work in terms of a career has like a sort of narrative arc, a trajectory.
Which is why generally if you're working in a local shop, you don't call it a career, you call it a job. Right?
Next up, what is value? Or when we think of things being value add, which is something we'll talk about a lot in these episodes, what do we mean there?
I suppose ultimately any sort of value is, it comes back to a sort of utilitarian perspective where it's like you are providing benefit, and the core like outcome of benefit is improving living standards and improving like mental welfare, as in like I say mental welfare as in people enjoy stuff, right? That's difficult because you could have a like destitute economy where like people are kind of happy, but you also think about like standards of living, right? So that would be some of the stuff that you think about there, like basically like useful goods and services, things that people are willing to pay for, not forced to pay for because they contribute positively to their lives.
And so then when we come to the sort of title kind of element of definition, I mean, actually rewind a little bit and going slightly off script, Is value necessarily the same as meaning?
No. So there's a presumption here, which we talk a little bit about. But like generally, when you talk to people and you say to them, "Oh, like what do you want to do with your life, with your career?" Right? A lot of people will say stuff like, "Make a difference, have an impact, add value," these sort of things, right? So there is a presumption that like most healthy members of society or positive members of society do have this kind of drive to contribute positively, right? Like, and it makes sense. It's a social thing. We're social creatures. We are driven to feel connected to people. It can be a source of huge happiness to feel like a valued member of a community. And the way that you do that is by contributing positively, right?
Yeah, I think so. That's what people would tend to understand as fulfilling work. It's work where you can see yourself contributing, making a difference,
doing something positive, right?
And then sort of being rewarded for that.
Yeah,
for sure.
I would also say that there's a few different elements. I remember there's that, I think it's a TED Talk or something similar, where they talk about like a few of the things that make work fulfilling, and it's like some of the things you're looking for are autonomy. So
this is Dan Pink. I love this.
Is it Dan Pink? Okay, autonomy, mastery, the feeling that you're learning things and getting good at things. What would another example be?
Purpose is the
purpose. Well, this fills that purpose part. The contributing positively fills purpose, but it doesn't necessarily fill those other two. And what was the fourth one?
I think it's just three.
It's just three. Okay.
Yeah. Autonomy, mastery, and purpose.
Yep.
It's interesting that he defines those three because it's contrasted with just like the extrinsic reward of more pay.
Yeah.
Because people tend to say,
yes,
pay people more and you'll get more results. And he's saying actually when it comes to creative or cognitively challenging work, paying people more doesn't necessarily drive better results. It's giving people freedom, giving them a sense of like, I'm getting better at this.
Yep.
And giving them a kind of deeper reason. And that's what drives results.
But it's interesting because it's one of those weird things where it's like, because it's three, it immediately kind of creates this sort of sense of like, oh, they're all equal, right? Purpose is the overriding one.
I think so.
And autonomy and mastery are more like features that like managers should try to build into jobs to keep people motivated or like keep people feel engaged, right? But like the fundamental one is purpose. Like if I had to choose between, if I could only pick one, purpose is the one that I and most people would pick. That said, you could do something that's fantastic, but you could find it incredibly boring and then it's kind of hard to stick at, right?
Yeah. And it's interesting when you break it down like that, because I think a lot of people go into challenging careers where, let's say you're going to, pick a hedge fund or an investment bank or something.
Yeah, like high frequency trading, you're all physics PhDs or whatever. Like it's really interesting, like in terms of mastery and autonomy.
Is probably the one that you get the most out of, and maybe you get some autonomy or maybe not, depending on the way the job is structured. But you probably have to then derive purpose from your sense of mastery or from...
Yeah, you kind of need to do some mental gymnastics where it's like, oh, this is providing purpose because it fits into some narrative of like enriching my life through, I don't know, cash or status or something like that. But then fundamentally, like I think people miss that final step where like the reason people tend to want those things like power, money, status is to convert it into something positive at some level, right? Well, I mean, some number of people will say like, oh, I just want to make money and then hang out and chill, right? I think that's an unhealthy perception of work. I don't think that's a real perception of work, right? Like when you actually think...
It's quite a reductive perception.
It's a very sort of neoliberal capitalist, like work is a terrible thing that you put up with just so that you have free time. And really what people want to do is nothing all the time, which I don't agree with. Like actually people do lots of creative, interesting stuff. They just don't categorize it as work because it's been so ingrained that it should be like things that you hate that you have to do because they pay. This is the fundamental issue, is that there's now a disjoint between like what's valuable or enriching to you personally or to society more widely, and what pays well.
And then lastly, the final definition. We've kind of walked around it, but what would you say is low value work? Because when you first sent me your essay, you said, it's time to swear off low value work. That was kind of the working title.
Yeah.
Talk to us about that.
In fairness, that's a little bit, I realize now that that's a confusing title just because low value could come about in two ways, right? When you think about any company, and you think about like Adam Smith's idea of the invisible hand and stuff, basically the idea is that, or the capitalist paradigm is that profit is basically a sign that you're doing something good, right? Within reason, like actually you in a perfectly competitive market, your profit should be competed away effectively. But in reality, you keep a little bit. Profit should be a sign that you're doing something value accretive, right? It means you're taking some raw resources, like they could be physical, it could be time, it could be space, whatever, and you're turning them into something that's more valuable than those raw resources themselves and the cost of converting it into something. And that's why you get to keep profit, right? But if you actually think about value creation and profit is basically a proportion of the value that you create. And some companies or activities can create a huge amount of value and then either choose to or not be able to capture a large part of it. So Wikipedia is a great example of like huge value capture, no profit, and maybe they wouldn't have been able to create as much value if there was a profit incentive somehow baked in there. Sometimes, you can find a business model that makes sense, sometimes you can't. However, so when you say low value, it could be either hugely valuable to society, low value capture, or it could be fundamentally low value production, right?
So not actually of value to society.
Not something that doesn't add that much value, and then as a result, you're not capturing that much as profit. However, this is where I realize it's not that great a title, low value work, because it captures those two. The thing that I really have an issue with is rent seeking, right?
Yes, tell us about that.
Yes.
What is rent seeking?
So when we were talking about profits just then, we're talking about it in the context of the invisible hand. It's like, I'm adding value. I keep a little bit of that value, and that's the capitalist incentive, that's profit, and that's when profit means I'm doing good, right? The problem is what happens when in economics a rent is actually like an undeserved gain, right? What happens when you start to have all these people who realize that actually it's easier to extract rents from the people around you or from other companies and services. So instead of, say, for example, adding X and then taking some percentage of X as your profit, you can just take someone else's X, right?
So, people will be most familiar with the concept of rent in the context of housing. We did a whole series on property recently. But when you're talking about rent here and rent seeking in particular, can you give us an example?
Yes. Okay. So it would be, for example, say an investment bank is doing an IPO, right?
So investment bank.
Yeah. It's always going to be, so investment. Lots of people don't understand this, right? So they're saying, often like a new stock will come to the market or whatever. Investment bank does the IPO, and it's like, it has a huge pop on the first day. Yay, great, right? And a lot of people think that's a good thing. And they don't realize like what's actually happened is if there's a huge pop on the first day, that means that the initial price that they offered to their clients was too low. It means they mispriced the company. Like imagine if you're a shareholder in the company, right? You've just raised the X valuation and then it doubles the next day. That's right. On the one hand, you'd be like, okay, it's cool that the valuation doubled. But on the other, it'd be like, well, why the hell did I just raise it that value then? Because literally the business is not different to 24 hours ago, right? You've just priced it incorrectly for your clients to get basically a free benefit, right? Or a special benefit. That's a little confusing, but just to use the term, so rent seeking in this economic sense is when rather than creating value and taking a portion of it, you are just capturing someone else's value. Another really good example that is like a classic one is asset managers. People who advise people on how to move their stocks and shares around, right? This is my biggest bugbear because there's plenty of evidence that actually asset managers just don't beat index funds. Like the S&P 500 did a study and it was like over a 15-year period, 95% of asset managers didn't beat just an index of the market. Right.
And I think you often see stuff around like, I don't know how true this is, but if you've got like chimps to pick stocks at random, right?
Yeah.
Or literally like people were to behave in that way, you actually outperform.
Yeah.
Not of everyone.
Some number of them you will, yeah.
Some number of them you will.
And the thing is actually they're charging you for the time and services that's going into their research that's actually contributing no value. That's actually like empirically not adding anything.
And yet they're such successful industries.
So that's an example of a rent, right? They are charging you to do worse than just indexing the market, right? So that's actually just extracting value from you. The thing I find so interesting about that industry as well is like, that's the empirical fact, right? The 5% who do beat the market over a 15-year period, I don't know off the top of my head, but I would say that 5% is like, well, a large number that, some number of people are going to beat the market just by sheer chance. If it was a distribution, normal distribution even. So, you could literally have the chimps and like some groups of chimps would beat the market. It would become a smaller and smaller amount over time as the time becomes larger and larger, right? But that's just survivorship bias. But then, flip it around. Okay, let's say that what they did work, right? And this is something that drives me mad. Okay, you have some people who you can pay and then they can help you do better than everyone else in the market. Right. So in the very best case, all you're saying is that the rich can pay to get richer faster than everyone else, which really is just going to be pulling wealth because the secondary stock market, it's winners and losers, right?
It's a zero-sum game.
It's a zero-sum game, right? Depending on the time horizon, we can all go into index funds and stuff, but then you're also creating a bubble, which hurts everyone eventually, right? Which is kind of what we're seeing now. But largely, if we're talking trading in the, short to midterm, it's a zero-sum game. Like, if a stock goes up, the person that I bought it from has lost out there, right? So you're basically saying that we could create a service that would successfully transfer wealth based on how much you could pay. Right.
Which sounds like it's going to exacerbate inequality.
Yeah, which sounds like that would just feed into inequality, right? But instead, it's okay, that's not true. Instead, they're just rent seeking. Instead, they're just destroying value. So that's kind of, I think that the fundamental issue that I see in society at the moment is that, I will read from a paragraph.
Go on, Colliers, 2022.
Yeah. In a post-war haze of the mid-20th century, Graduates from the world's greatest institutions left education with a burning desire to address some of the world's biggest issues: global health, making space travel a reality, doing genuine good within our governments. Now we take graduate schemes that ship us to companies we hold unamicable feelings towards, so we can help decide how to ship a new product designed to leech our attention, or maybe we advise other businesses on how many staff they can fire. We rearrange PowerPoints at large banks or advise the already rich on how to rearrange their portfolio on a secondary market. All this just so that we may hope to build up a deposit for the unlivable circumstances of pretty much any major metropolitan area in the 21st century. I appreciate that reality can often get in the way of our dreams, but it frustrates me to see the number of my peers who succumb to this set of aspirations versus aiming to change the world for the better, as if financial success cannot simply be done in tandem, and that success in any field can't realistically lead to a dignified life.
It's very poetic. And we'll take that point to have a quick ad break, but we'll be back.
That's so good.
Okay, everybody, welcome back. You just heard Ant's actually really quite well-written assessment of the problem. So I think now we understand the problem, but let's break it down now. Why do you think this happens, particularly on a sort of individual aspirational level? What's going on?
I think genuinely, it's funny how it's come into sharp focus recently, this kind of cost of living crisis. But I think so many people are missing that this has been to some extent decades in the making, and there's so many layers to this. And to
some extent weeks, thanks to Liz Truss. But
it's genuinely short term to some extent weeks, some extent years, to some extent decades. Right? We have been at near zero interest rates since 2008, not sustainable. But then also, if you think about economic activity and support over COVID, I think a lot of people don't realize that a lot of the economic impacts that we're seeing now were inevitable outcomes of the spending and protections that we were offering during COVID. I mean, the amount of money that each government was putting into supporting people, in our case, furlough, R being UK, in the US case, the direct cash deposits, and how that was inevitably going to be driving up inflation as kind of economic activity restarted. And actually still, when you think about raw resources and stuff, still super expensive because supply chains are still kind of backed up.
There's locked up from all the sort of COVID problems and issues they were having before.
So there's some issues there. But I mean, again, another reading. I think the fundamental issue isn't so much the choices people are making, but the structures that exist. Quote, our economies are no longer serving adequate infrastructure to properly incentivize productive activity, and that the bar for living a dignified life is simply rising too quickly. Sorry, there was a little pause there because I wrote bear instead of bar.
Sometimes you eat the bar and sometimes the bar eats you.
Yes. So in layman's terms, there's too much opportunity and pressure to take on very high paying but socially unproductive work. And that very high paying work as well is something to do with the obsession with GDP versus real value, right? Because I think the interesting thing about so much of this rent-seeking work that I'm calling relatively low value is that it's all meta industries, right?
It's like you were saying, it's on secondary markets. It's all stuff that's meta is the perfect word because it is layered on top of work that's actually fundamentally...
It's work on top of work, right? So everyone's like, oh, the stock market, and people work on the stock market and work on finance. People don't realize that finance is supposed to provide finance to actual businesses, right? To people who are actually doing stuff, who are actually making things, selling things, doing things for people, right? So all the investment banks, if there's no actual companies to IPO who are actually doing stuff, they have no one to IPO. They have no one to sell their stocks to.
It's fascinating to me that there's still so much glamour surrounding those industries, actually, because I remember that growing up in the build up to 08, they were quite glorified industries, even though you had sort of the kind of Wolf of Wall Street-esque negativity around it as well. It was always something as seen if you're bright, you go into finance, you can make tons of money, high octane career, it's exciting. In many ways, I think it was over-glamorized, and I think I'm surprised that 08 hasn't recalibrated that. I think to some extent it has. I think tech has
stepped in there as well, and tech has the benefit of being super scalable. I think the fundamental issue is that the cost of living and life in general has reached the point where there's far too many fields, and they're important fields, where you could be doing exceptionally well and you would not lead a comfortable life. You could be a very successful doctor. Unless you took on a bunch of private work as well, you would not live a good life. I mean, if you think about...
if you're capable of becoming a doctor, you're clearly bright enough to be doing similarly well. Your opportunity cost is high. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I've met some doctors and... I do find, if you take, the salary range that we offer junior doctors as an example, or take the salary range that we offer... Another one, barristers aren't paid particularly well, are they?
Yeah, again, have to be really highly qualified as well.
Yep, and you have to be really, really highly qualified. All of these sort of career tracks where actually it takes well into your 40s, 50s to earn enough to really have a kind of comfortable life commensurate with the level of time that you've put in and your relative skill set. To quote, necessity seems to have forced the modern graduate to focus first and foremost on cash so that we may one day claw together enough for a deposit on a mortgage. This effective economic serfdom is the frustrating part. Many millennials in such circumstances, quote, are only going to do it until they've saved up enough. end quote. A statement that acknowledges their position as an economic captive. But so it goes, as long as the returns to capital are greater than the returns to labor, our youth is best spent amassing as much capital as is possible. Our greatest dreams watered down to the hope that we might save up enough to spend at least a bit of our working life doing something we actually care about.
I'm really glad you mentioned the returns to capital and the returns to labor, because I think it's a good time to introduce Thomas Piketty, famous economist. We've talked about him on previous episodes. I'll give you a quick rundown of him again here. So what Piketty did that was fascinating was the prevailing economic consensus before he came around and published his work, Capital in the 21st Century, was that general GDP growth was for the benefit of all society. There was this kind of concept of trickle-down economics, the idea that, as the rich get richer, it feeds down to the rest of society. And
I mean, this at the most extreme end, this is just the Adam Smithism, which also is deeply misunderstood, because Adam Smith often says, like, in well-governed societies, and actually was
nice caveats.
Yeah, exactly. He was a rather liberal person by the standards of the time, and he was very much for the opinion, like, well, obviously governments wouldn't just allow rent-seeking companies to exist. That was in no one's interest, right? But instead, he's used as a kind of free market idol. Free meaning free of any sort of interaction or limitations, despite the fact that he himself was very liberal.
Indeed. Coming back to Piketty, what's so sort of impactful about the data he publishes is that he just collects loads of stats, like so much data over the last sort of centuries, and demonstrates empirically that society is actually getting more unequal, not less. And that's driven by this fundamental dynamic you mentioned, which is that the returns to capital outstrip the returns to labor. So as you get richer, you accrue more capital. The capital works for itself. It generates incomes. And at some point, that wealth accelerates. You become wealthier and wealthier. On the other hand, if you're just selling your time, if you're just a laborer, if you're just working, your income goes up a lower percentage. There's a gap that builds, and that gap is only being exacerbated by time. So
between the fact that the returns to capital are greater than returns to labor, and the fact that asset prices are rising so quickly, so assets we're going to need, like houses, you want to buy as soon as possible, people are under pressure to earn as much money as quickly as possible. And I think the interesting thing is that there is some cultural understanding of this. Like if you think about post-08, I think, again, a quote, the conclusion we drew above, or have been talking about, doesn't fit the modern zeitgeist. There's in fact a cultural dichotomy between doing good and making money. Doing good is working at a charity, making money is working at an investment bank. So how has this kind of come about to be the case? Like, why is it that we have built that kind of separation between the two over time?
Well, in the next episode, we'll get more into why we think, like, what can be done about this problem, why the system is kind of broken down to this extent, and what we'd like to do to solve it. To wrap up this one, do you have a quick summary of why you think capitalism is letting us down? Is it even capitalism that's to blame? What's going wrong here?
No, I think that there's actually lots of great things about capitalism. I'm not advocating for some different form of society at large. I think the major issues is just
seize the means of production.
That's exactly not what I'm saying. I actually think, like, ironically, the nuance of Adam Smith himself is exactly what's missing, right? Like, the profit-making incentive and self-focused incentives do make sense, but we should be basically regulating or making unappealing rent-seeking activities that are not actually that helpful. Instead, we just have realized, and we'll talk a bit about why some of his models have failed, or his ideas of human behavior and interaction don't really bear out in the real world. If you actually follow and understand his nuance, you'll see that he just uses kind of, and he does say it in much greater detail, but, we'll use terms like well-governed, right? That's the part that we're missing. We're not actually governing out of existence activities that suck value out of other places in society rather than generate their profits by contributing and taking a portion.
It's that purist perspective, isn't it? It's, I think, in some ways where we let ourselves down societally in the last sort of 30, 40 years, and certainly in the build-up to 08, was this undue idolization of free market economics and this idea of free markets without constraint, as in too much emphasis on the free part of the market. Because exactly like you say, markets aren't perfect systems. There need to be rules, there need to be regulations, and there needs to be good government.
However, in defense of markets, like, it's not to say that, like I said, markets function well. It's the contributions of private companies over time who have a profit-making incentive. Granted, there's some amount of, like, public goods like GPS and whatever that have come into this that made it really effective. But it's the culmination of those things over time that make life today so much better than 200 years ago for everyone, right? Like, iPhones and the internet and all the products that you can access so easily for free online. Like, I can type into a bloody search bar and generate an image of whatever I want now. I mean, that's not a huge societal benefit, but you get what I mean. Like, I can call
on thrones.
Exactly.
Tudor art.
I did actually make that immediately, but, like, I can travel across the planet affordably, remit money anywhere in the world affordably, work from anywhere. Like, all of these things are
a miracle of modern technology.
Genuinely, all kind of layered on top of each other and rippling outwards, right? But that's also actual value productive activities, not because of investment bankers and lawyers that I'm able to do all those things. I think Adam Smith has a nice quote on that as well. It is the great multiplication of productions of all the different arts in consequence of the division of labour, which occasions, in a well-governed society, that universal opulence which extends itself to the lowest ranks of the people.
That's a lovely quote on which to end. So thank you guys for listening. Again, thanks for leaving reviews. Thanks for sharing this podcast if you enjoy it. We really appreciate it. And we'll be back very, very soon with the follow-on to this episode.
Yes, we'll discuss why Adam Smith's model fails and what we can do, why rent-seeking continues, and what we as individuals and people in general can look to do to change it.
Awesome.